everyone. It's me, Lois, with Aussie Lozzie Knit Designs, and we're continuing our conversation on gauge. So yesterday we did a definition, which is the amount of space that a stitch takes up and the number of stitches in rows over a 4 by 4 inch square or 10 by 10 centimeter square. And then today, I thought we'd just dive right into the question that everyone wants to know, which is, does gauge actually matter? When does it matter? And when can I let it slide? And the great part about this is that you, the knitter, get to decide this. You get to choose. And so I can't dictate that for you. That's something that you have to decide for yourself. And I certainly decide it for myself. So I'm going to talk a little bit more and give you some insight, of course, but so whenever I'm knitting a hat, I rarely do a swatch. If I'm designing a hat, I'll do a swatch. And actually, sometimes I just knit the hat itself and use that gauge that I found when I knit the hat if it fits right, and tweak it if it doesn't. And I've knit gauge, I think I said twice. So the other time was I was making a hat for my father, and it was the first time that I was knitting for my dad, and I wanted it to just be so perfect. And so I did a gauge swatch and I matched gauge, and you know what? It didn't work. It didn't work at all. The hat ended up being like ginormous, and I had knit it with wool. So I was like, well, I'll just throw it in the dryer and shrink it a little. I forgot to pull it out of the dryer. It shrank a lot. It is now, we have one of those like big pops of Pusheen Kitty. Do you know who that is? And he's holding like a slice of pizza. And it actually is like one of those cute little caps with like the brim that sticks out. Anyway, it's Pusheen the Kitty's felted hat now, and my dad got another beanie that I wasn't so precious about. But all that to say that sometimes a pattern, and this was a pattern published by a company, it was not like me by myself, this was put out by a company. Sometimes their gauge doesn't match the numbers that they're telling you, even if it's been tech edited. So there's so many things that can happen that don't go right that are not you, the knitter's fault. That's a tangent I did not intend on going on, sorry. But anyway, so when I'm knitting a hat, I usually don't measure or do a gauge swatch. A third time I did it, I was doing a test knit. And then I did get gauge, but again, the gauge had been off for what they had put in their pattern, but it was still in the test knitting phase. So it was fine because I was the only knitter who found that, and we were able to, the pattern designer was fixing it, and they are an indie designer. So companies don't always mean excellent patterns. That's the moral story. Anyway, for hats, I don't usually get a gauge swatch because we have lots of different size hats in our family, and it always finds a home. It always finds a home. When it comes to knitting a sweater, I would always get gauge because that's a lot of yarn, it's a lot of time, and the last thing I want is to have it come out wonky or not fitting the way that it's supposed to in the pattern. So for me, knitting a sweater, always gauge. It's worth that extra time. Another thing I don't really gauge is scarves or blankets or dishcloths or anything like that. Just no. No, I don't want to spend my time knitting a gauge swatch for something like that. But here's what you should know when you're making those kinds of decisions if you're a beginner, right? Which is, what weight yarn did they call for in the pattern, and what weight yarn are you using? This is a huge indicator on whether or not you need to gauge for yourself, which you can decide over time. So I'm not saying gauge, not gauge on things. You have to decide. But if you're knitting a bulky hat, but you decided to use an Aran weight yarn, then you're not going to get gauge, right? And and then it's going to actually come out way smaller. So those are kinds of things that if you are going to do that, you might want to go ahead and make a gauge swatch so you can make other adjustments while you're knitting. But if you're knitting a worsted weight hat with worsted weight yarn, you could decide not to do gauge. I do that all the time, and it usually, like, it always works out. I think of the 3 times that I've knit gauge swatch for a hat, the time I met gauge before I knit the hat was the worst one because the gauge didn't match the pattern. Bummer. And I paid for that pattern. Shame on you. I won't say who it was. They're very reputable. It happens, guys. Mistakes happen. Anyway, so gauge does matter, especially if you're knitting with sweaters or if you're knitting something with like really expensive yarn. I wouldn't want to waste that yarn. If I'm knitting a hat for myself or for someone else with very expensive yarn, it's worth that swatch to make sure that hat's going to fit. Like, you don't want to waste that yarn, right? But if you're using, cheaper yarn, who cares? That's my philosophy on the matter. And so then when it comes to matching gauge, another thing is don't be so super precious about it. Meaning that if you have to get 26 stitches per 4 inches and you have 25 and a half, you're okay. Or if you have 25 and 3/4, you're okay. Don't be so caught up in that fraction of a stitch, right? Don't get so caught up in that because knit fabric stretches, right? We know that it does. And also, you could spend a lot of time trying to shave off that half of a stitch, which if you're getting 26, let's make it easier number, 20 stitches per 4 inches, that's 5 stitches per inch. It's not going to be that impactful depending on your measurements, right? And if you're knitting an oversized sweater, it would be less impactful. And these are all things that you could take into consideration. Wow, I had a lot to say about this. So another thing really quick, and then we'll wrap it up because maybe I should have prepared a shorter version of this. But if you're knitting a sweater and you are off on gauge, like say a stitch or something, you could, if it's an oversized sweater, calculate what that would mean over the course of the sweater and then decide to knit down a size or vice versa, right? And so those are all math calculations that you can do. Just take your stitch count, take your measurements, divide, multiply, blah, blah, blah. And then there you go. Then you know what size that you should make, and that would work too. All right. So I actually did practice this. I do want to say that. I did practice this, and I went on a tangent in my practice, and I was like, I'm not going to go on a tangent when I do it for real. Like, I'm going to rein it in. And I went on a totally different tangent. Oops. Sorry. Anyway, I'll be back tomorrow. We'll continue the conversation on gauge. I did find my notebook, but I don't have it in front of me. And so I can't exactly remember what our gauge talk will be about tomorrow. We think it's measuring gauge. So we'll get on our hands and we'll bring out the tape and we're going to have so much fun doing that. Anyway, if you liked this video, would you please hit like, share, and subscribe? Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.